Section 4. The Tyranny of Trusts. We have, most of us, met in literature, and even in life, a certain sort of old gentleman. He is very often represented by an old clergyman. He is the sort of man who has a horror of socialists without any very definite idea of what they are. He is the man of whom men say that he means well, by which they mean that he means nothing. But this view is a little unjust to this social type. He is really something more than well-meaning. We might even go so far as to say that he would probably be right-thinking, if he ever thought. His principles would probably be sound enough, if they were really applied. It is his practical ignorance that prevents him from knowing the world to which they are applicable. He might really be right, only he has no notion of what is wrong. Those who have sat under this old gentleman know that he is in the habit of softening his stern repudiation of the mysterious socialists by saying that, of course, it is a Christian duty to use our wealth well, to remember that property is a trust committed to us by Providence for the good of others as well as ourselves, and even, unless the old gentleman is old enough to be a modernist, that it is just possible that we may some day be asked a question or two about the abuse of such a trust. Now, all this is perfectly true, so far as it goes, but it happens to illustrate in a rather curious way the queer and even uncanny innocence of the old gentleman. The very phrase that he uses when he says that property is a trust committed to us by Providence is a phrase which takes on, when it is uttered to the world around him, the character of an awful and appalling pun. His pathetic little sentence returns in 100 howling echoes, repeating it again and again, like the laughter of 100 fiends in hell. Property is a trust. Now, I could not more conveniently sum up what I mean by this first section than by taking this type of the dear old conservative clergyman, and considering the curious way in which he has been first caught napping, and then, as it were, knocked on the head. The first thing we have had to explain to him is expressed in that horrible pun about the trust. While he has been crying out against imaginary robbers, whom he calls socialists, he has been caught and carried away bodily by real robbers, whom he still could not even imagine. For the gangs of gamblers who make the great combines are really gangs of robbers, in the sense that they have far less feeling than anybody else for that individual responsibility for individual gifts of God, which the old gentleman very rightly calls a Christian duty. While he has been weaving words in the air about irrelevant ideals, he has been caught in a net woven out of the very opposite words and notions: impersonal, irresponsible, irreligious. The financial forces that surround him are further away than anything else from the domestic idea of ownership with which, to do him justice, he himself began. So that when he still bleats faintly, "Property is a trust," we shall reply firmly, "A trust is not property." And now I come to the real extraordinary thing about the old gentleman. I mean that I come to the queerest fact about the conventional or conservative type in modern English society. And that is the fact that the same society, which began by saying that there was no such danger to avoid, now says that the danger cannot possibly be avoided. Our whole capitalist community has taken one huge stride from the extreme of optimism to the extreme of pessimism. They began by saying that there could not be trusts in this country. They have ended by saying that there cannot be anything else except trusts in this age. And in the course of calling the same thing impossible on Monday and inevitable on Tuesday, they have saved the life of the great gambler or robber twice over, first by calling him a fabulous monster, and second by calling him an almighty fate. 12 years ago, when I talked of trusts, people said, "There are no trusts in England." Now, when I say it, the same people say, "But how do you propose that England should escape from the trusts?" They talk as if the trust had always been a part of the British Constitution, not to mention the solar system. In short, the pun and parable with which I began this article have exactly and ironically come true. The poor old clergyman is now really driven to talk as if a trust, with a big T, was something that had been bestowed on him by Providence. He is driven to abandon all that he originally meant by his own curious sort of Christian individualism, and hastily reconcile himself to something that is more like a sort of plutocratic collectivism. He is beginning, in a rather bewildered way, to understand that he must now say that monopoly, and not merely private property, is a part of the nature of things. The net had been thrown over him while he slept. because he never thought of such a thing as a net, because he would have denied the very possibility of anybody weaving such a net. But now the poor old gentleman has begun to talk as if he had been born in the net. Perhaps, as I say, he has had a knock on the head. Perhaps, as his enemies say, he was always just a little weak in the head. But anyhow, now that his head is in the noose, or the net, he will often start preaching to us about the impossibility of escaping from nets and nooses that are woven or spun upon the wheel of the fates. In a word, I wish to point out that the old gentleman was much too heedless about getting into the net, and is much too hopeless about getting out of it. In short, I would sum up my general suggestion so far by saying that the chief danger to be avoided now, and the first danger to be considered now, is the danger of supposing the capitalist conquest more complete than it is. If I may use the terms of the penny catechism about the two sins against hope, the peril now is no longer the peril of presumption, but rather of despair. It is not mere impudence like that of those who told us, without winking an eyelid, that there were no trusts in England. It is rather mere impotence like that of those who tell us that England must soon be swallowed up in an earthquake called America. Now, this sort of surrender to modern monopoly is not only ignoble, it is also panic-stricken and premature. It is not true that we can do nothing. What I have written so far has been directed to showing the doubtful and the terrified that it is not true that we can do nothing. Even now there is something that can be done, and done at once, though the things to be done may appear to be of different kinds, and even of degrees of effectiveness. Even if we only save a shop in our own street, or stop a conspiracy in our own trade, or get a bill to punish such conspiracies pressed by our own member, we may come in the nick of time and make all the difference. To vary the metaphor to a military one, what has happened is that the monopolists have attempted an encircling movement. But the encircling movement is not yet complete. Unless we do something, it will be complete. But it is not true to say that we can do nothing to prevent it being completed. We are in favor of striking out, of making sorties or sallies, of trying to pierce certain points in the line, far enough apart and chosen for their weakness, of breaking through the gap in the uncompleted circle. Most people around us are for surrender to the surprise, precisely because it was to them so complete a surprise. Yesterday they denied that the enemy could encircle. The day before yesterday they denied that the enemy could exist. They are paralyzed as by a prodigy. But just as we never agreed that the thing was impossible, so we do not now agree that it is irresistible. Action ought to have been taken long ago, but action can still be taken now. That is why it is worthwhile to dwell on the diverse expedients already given as examples. A chain is as strong as its weakest link. A battle line is as strong as its weakest man. An encircling movement is as strong as its weakest point, the point at which the circle may still be broken. Thus, to begin with, if anybody asks me in this matter, what am I to do now? I answer, do anything, however small, that will prevent the completion of the work of capitalist combination. Do anything that will even delay that completion. Save one shop out of 100 shops. Save one craft out of 100 crafts. Keep open one door out of 100 doors, for so long as one door is open, we are not in prison. Throw up one barricade in their way, and you will soon see whether it is the way the world is going. Put one spoke in their wheel, and you will soon see whether it is the wheel of fate. For it is of the essence of their enormous and unnatural effort that a small failure is as big as a big failure. The modern commercial combine has a great many points in common with the big balloon. It is swollen, and yet it is swollen with levity. It climbs, and yet it drifts. Above all, it is full of gas, and generally of poison gas. But the resemblance most relevant here is that the smallest prick will shrivel the biggest balloon. If this tendency of our time received anything like a reasonably definite check, I believe the whole tendency would soon begin to weaken in its preposterous prestige. Until monopoly is monopolist, it is nothing. Until the combine can combine everything, it is nothing. Ahab has not his kingdom so long as Naboth has his vineyard. Haman will not be happy in the palace while Mordecai is sitting in the gate. 100 tales of human history are there to show that tendencies can be turned back, and that one stumbling block can be the turning point. The sands of time are simply dotted with single stakes that have thus marked the turn of the tide. The first step toward ultimately winning is to make sure that the enemy does not win, if it be only that he does not win everywhere. Then, when we have halted his rush, and perhaps fought it to a standstill, we may begin a general counter-attack. The nature of that counter-attack I shall next proceed to consider. In other words, I will try to explain to the old clergyman caught in the net, whose sufferings are ever before my eyes, what it will no doubt comfort him to know. That he was wrong from the first in thinking that there could be no net, that he is wrong now in thinking that there is no escape from the net, and that he will never know how wrong he was till he finds he has a net of his own, and is once more a fisher of men. I begin by enunciating the paradox that one way of supporting small shops would be to support them. Everybody could do it, but nobody can imagine it being done. In one sense, nothing is so simple, and in another, nothing is so hard. I went on to point out that without any sweeping change at all, the mere modification of existing laws would probably call thousands of little shops into life and activity. I may have occasion to return to the little shops at greater length, but for the moment I am only running rapidly through certain separate examples, to show that the citadel of plutocracy could even now be attacked from many different sides. It could be met by a concerted effort in the open field of competition. It could be checked by the creation or even correction of a large number of little laws. Thirdly, it could be attacked by the more sweeping operation of larger laws. But when we come to these, even at this stage, we also come into collision with larger questions. The common sense of Christendom, for ages on end, has assumed that it was as possible to punish cornering as to punish coining. Yet, to most readers today, there seems a sort of vital contradiction, echoed in the verbal contradiction of saying, "Put not your trust